In February of this year, Russian and Belarus armed forces held a joint military exercise called Union Resolve. When the maneuvers ended, Russian troops didn't return to their home bases. Instead, they used Belarus to launch a surprise attack towards Kiev. Since then, Belarus President Alexander Lukashenko has expressed support for the Russian offensive. However, he's far more reluctant about sending his troops into the war zone. But with the Russian troops in Ukraine being on the defensive, at times there have been concerns that Moscow might pressure Belarus into joining the war. In fact, Putin visited Belarus this past Monday for the first time since 2019. What could the Belarus armed forces bring to the table for Russia? How might they complicate matters for Ukraine? What political and even military risks might such a move pose to all the parties? Finally, what are the chances of any of this even happening? As the conflict impacts economies all around the world, core inflation is supposed to remain stubbornly high, so many people are scrambling to preserve their money in real physical assets. And that's where the sponsor of this video, Masterworks, steps in. Before, physical assets meant gold or real estate, but those may not perform well next year. Thankfully, there's another option: fine art. Morgan Stanley says fine art often experiences less volatility than other investments. Last time inflation was this high, fine art had incredible appreciation, averaging 17.5% per year, according to the Masterworks All Art database. Masterworks has used fine art to hand back incredible results to their investors by filing multi-million-dollar paintings with the SEC and splitting them into shares. We're talking about Picassos and Banksys. Investing in such works would otherwise be out of my reach, but Masterworks makes it possible to own their shares. I can't believe no one thought of that before. And Masterworks just pulled off another strategic exit at the end of November for a 13.9% net return. That brings them to 9 exits, 4 of them in the last 3 months alone. Those 4 sales returned between 13 and 33% net. Wild numbers. The paintings have sold out in minutes, but you can get priority access right away by clicking the link in the description below. At 9.3 million residents, Belarus is not a rich or populous country. Its armed force is sort of similar to the Scandinavian model, in so much that it maintains a small active service troop contingent, and a lot of their army units operate at half capacity during peacetime. In times of war, Belarus would have to call in thousands of reservists just to fill in its army units. Even so, Belarus can't afford an all-professional army. This is why the country regularly enlists conscripts, usually for a period of 18 months. Little under half the entire Belarusian active-duty military is made up of conscripts. Given that the active-duty units are to be manned by reservists as well, the overall competency of average army units in a war is not likely to be high. Belarusian army is thus mostly poised to perform defensive duties. Some reservists periodically get mobilization calls for exercises. According to the Belarus Ministry of Defense, 130,000 reservists went through some training in the last 20 years, suggesting some 6,000 people getting some training per year. On paper, the Ministry of Defense hopes 500,000 men with some experience could be mobilized in a total war, but a more organized reserve is embodied in the Belarusian Territorial Army. A reservist formation not unlike most other territorial armies. Civilians which once served in the army and who are under obligation to serve if a war comes. Despite some purchases of equipment from China, the bulk of Belarus armed forces still relies heavily on Russian weapon systems, most of which were designed during the Cold War. Due to budgetary issues, only some of these have been modernized. For example, while the army includes almost 500 main battle tanks, most of those are still 1980s T-72 variants. All these systems could help replenish some of the Russian hardware losses. A few thousand armored vehicles is actually a large number, enough to last for months at the current pace of the war. But it's extremely unlikely Belarus would simply give away most of their hardware and thus strip its own military of any meaningful punch. So if Belarus does send some hardware to Russia, it would likely be closer to a few hundred pieces instead of over 1,000. Belarus armed forces follow the Russian military doctrine that stresses the importance of artillery in battle. Besides the artillery in maneuver brigades, the Joint Command operates additional artillery units. The very long-range rocket units are, for example, under its command. as are the Soviet-era Tochka ballistic missiles. There are also Chinese-sourced Polonez systems which fire satellite-guided missiles to massive distances. Those are perhaps the most interesting systems that Belarus could add to the Russian campaign, but their numbers are likely fairly low, and it's unknown how many missiles Belarus might have for them. Just like China isn't sending military aid to Russia, it's unlikely it would start selling additional missiles to Belarus either. Plus, one important issue would remain for Russia. Very long-range guided strikes are not as useful when Russia largely lacks recon and intelligence gathering capabilities. Generally speaking, the Belarus Air Force suffers from the same problems as the country's ground forces. While there have been attempts at modernization, most of the weaponry is outdated due to budgetary reasons. For example, Belarus still operates Soviet-era MiG-29s. Only recently has the country imported 4 of the more modern Su-30 SM flankers from Russia, with more on the way. Air Force assets are thus almost useless to Russia. Even if some operate against Ukraine, their numbers and low capability levels would not mean much. Belarus aircraft are split between 3 main air bases. However, Belarus also maintains several additional standby air bases that are mostly empty. Babruisk airbase, for example, has been set aside for use by the Russian Air Force, though there have been other bases used by Russians as well. Indeed, one of the more meaningful Belarusian contributions to this war has been supplying Russia with air bases for attacks on Ukraine. Air defense forces are tasked with protecting the Belarus airspace. 3 brigades and 7 regiments are broadly spread into 2 air defense rings. The outer ring covers the areas bordering various NATO countries. The inner air defense ring is protecting the capital city Minsk. Altogether, air and air defense forces have over 11,000 servicemen. The air defenses could be a bit more useful to Russia than the Belarusian Air Force, but only in a niche role set, say supporting some strikes against the Kiev area. Alternatively, sending some air defense battery all the way to the south to protect approaches to Crimea or Donbass is also possible, but those numbers would not be meaningful additions either. Belarus is a fairly large, mostly flat country bordering several NATO countries. As such, it is a perfect staging ground for launching a major attack into other countries. This is precisely what Russia did in February 2022. Since then, Russian armed forces successfully launched drone and missile strikes against targets in western Ukraine. The border between Belarus and Ukraine stretches for over 600 kilometers. Belarus could, at least in theory, aid Russia in a new attack to cut off Ukraine's connections with the West, but in reality that won't happen. In the field, Belarus armed forces could work well with the Russian military. Most of the country's weapons and technology come from Russia, which solves a number of logistical problems. 2 countries regularly hold bilateral army exercises. There have been at least 9 such exercises since September 2020. However, Russian influence goes far beyond that. If a large war comes, Belarus armed forces and special operational forces are to operate within Russia's First Guards tank army, thus effectively coming under the command of Russia's Joint Strategic Command West. This became evident during the Zapad 2017 military exercise. There's a similar agreement regarding Belarus air and air defense forces too. But such war plans don't really include the current Russian invasion of Ukraine. Still, even if Russia had complete control over Belarus active-duty armed forces, what could Russia really gain? For comparison, for millions of refugees that left Ukraine since the war started, Ukraine has possibly under 30 million people, accounting for those who returned. After the Russian invasion, Ukraine's government started mass mobilization. Ukraine now has some 900,000 military personnel. Russia has a population of around 147 million people, and even with the casualties it had so far, it still likely has 300,000 troops of various quality. That's without the recently announced plans to mobilize 300,000 additional soldiers, of which roughly a third have, according to Putin, reached Ukraine by November. So even if Belarus managed to send 2/3 of its military to Ukraine, say 30,000 troops, this wouldn't be a game changer, especially in the long run. But let's say Belarus tries to call up all of its troops, including reservists and territorial forces. All of them need to be equipped, trained and shipped to the front line. This presents both logistical and financial problems. Belarus Ministry of Defense devotes around 5% of its annual budget just for such a case, which is a lot. and yet their entire military budget for 2021 was tiny when compared to other countries. Then there's also the question of morale. While the conflict between Ukraine and Russia has been simmering since 2014, there hasn't been anything similar between Belarus and Ukraine. For years, Belarusian armed forces were far more concerned about the potential threat from NATO countries, leaving their country's border with Ukraine virtually undefended. The Belarus military also lacks experience. In the 3 decades that Belarus has been independent, its armed forces have not really seen combat. Even worse, outside of regular joint exercises with the Russians, the Belarus army rarely even organizes exercises above the battalion level. And then there's the Belarus leader, Alexander Lukashenko. He first became president in 1994. Ever since, he held onto power through various means. After Lukashenko won presidential elections yet again in August 2020, there was a huge public backlash against him. The government broke the protest using, among other means, military units. Lukashenko's control over Belarusians is not without limits. When the Russians launched an offensive from Belarus towards Kiev, some Belarus activists reportedly sabotaged railways to slow down the transport of Russian troops. And even now, there are hundreds of Belarus nationals who fled Belarus and are now living in Ukraine and fighting against Russia. Entering the war against Ukraine would probably cause at least some public unrest, especially if Belarus Ministry of Defense tries to send reservists or newly conscripted soldiers to the fight. Let us remember, even Russia itself did not dare to send conscripts into the war. To this day, it's not doing that. It took 7 months before Russia decided to do a limited mobilization of reservists. Doing mass mobilization might cause too much unrest in Russia. And the same might apply to Belarus, which is why Lukashenko would likely not even try to send conscripts to Ukraine, nor would he attempt a large-scale mobilization, sending unwilling reservists. If the same ratio of mobilized reservists that Russia did assemble so far is applied to Belarus, it would mean Belarus would assemble 19,000 additional reservist troops. But those would not only have even less war experience than Russian reservists, but would likely suffer big morale issues. After all, Belarus is a third party to the conflict, and most people in Belarus see even less reason to go to war than the average Russian. Furthermore, if Lukashenko sends out a lot of professional troops, he risks remaining unprotected at home in case of further protests and civil disobedience, which means even fewer Belarusian professional troops could in reality be mustered for Ukraine. It's not unrealistic to expect perhaps only 20 or 30,000 troops to be mustered for Ukraine, with a good deal of those being reservists. Such a figure would be a drop in the bucket in terms of Russian military needs. In the past, relations between Russia and Belarus have had their ups and downs. However, since the 2020 protests, President Lukashenko has been increasingly relying on Russia's support. There have also been reports about trains full of ammunition traveling from Belarus to Russia. Allegedly, Belarus sent almost 2,000 train cars full of ammo between February and September 2022. That's over 65,000 tons of ammo. Belarus has also allegedly been sending tanks to Russia, approximately 60 so far. While some of those numbers sound impressive, it has to be said that Russia has for years stored some ammo and other equipment in Belarusian facilities. After their losses in Ukraine, it would make sense for the Russian military to start retrieving stored vehicles and ammo. On October 10, 2022, Belarusian Ministry of Defense announced Russia will station around 9,000 soldiers in Belarus as a part of a joint regional military command. This caused concerns about Russia getting ready to launch a new offensive from Belarus. However, it is equally likely these are fresh recruits sent for training, since the Russian facilities are currently overwhelmed with new conscripts. There has also been talk about Belarus military drafting mechanics and drivers to help with Russian equipment. By allowing Russia to use Belarus as a staging and training area, as a place for maintenance and treatment of the wounded, President Lukashenko gets to show his support to Russia, without actually entering the war and risking unrest. Meanwhile, Russians get to train their recruits and restore some of their strength. All the while, their mere presence weakens Ukrainian forces, since now they have to monitor the Belarus border for an offensive that might never come. Opening up a new front into northern Ukraine at this stage of the war, when Ukraine is alerted, would require easily upward of 100,000 troops, likely over 200,000. Assembling that without being noticed would be impossible. And like we said, Belarus could contribute only a small part of such a force. Russia, on the other hand, doesn't really have troops to spare, as even the so far undistributed reservists will likely be much more needed to defend the south. Using such inexperienced troops as the tip of the spear in an offensive would only end in a disaster. At the same time, the Ukrainian military is fortifying positions against Belarus and mining bridges towards Belarus. The terrain on the Ukraine-Belarus border favors defenders. There are hills, forests, even some swamps, and relatively few roads which can easily become choke points for attackers. That's one of the reasons why the early Russian push towards Kiev failed so spectacularly. If Lukashenko does decide to get his troops involved, he could also send just a token number, say a few thousand of his most elite troops to Russia. Those would likely be the special ops troops mentioned earlier. Those would be at Russian disposal, probably used around Donbass or to defend in the south near Zaporozhye. But none of that really makes sense for Russia. Such a move would undoubtedly result in NATO sending further military and financial aid to Ukraine. Belarus would get even more sanctioned and equated with Russia. Further sanctions and diplomatic pressures could all help foster unrest in Belarus and destabilize Lukashenko. Even worse for Putin, such destabilization of Belarus might strip Russia of an important ally and staging grounds in the long term. And in the unlikely event Lukashenko does somehow get deposed, Putin might fear a wave of similar unrest spreading into Russia as well. So several thousand or even several tens of thousands of additional troops is simply not worth all that risk to Russia. In addition, by reinforcing troops near Belarus, NATO could tie Belarus forces in the northern and western parts of the country, instead of making them free for operations inside Ukraine. In the worst-case scenario for Russia, the West might see Belarus entering the war as such an escalation that some of its own countries might openly send troops into Ukraine, saying to Russia, "Hey, your Belarus started this escalation first." NATO could even test Russia using those troops in Ukraine to go north, attacking Belarus itself. Since Belarus is a separate country, it's not a given Russia would treat such an attack the same as an attack onto its own soil. And frankly, we've seen that even Ukrainian attacks on Kherson territories, which Russia annexed, still did not cause Russia to escalate the conflict. Russia apparently does have lots of reasons not to escalate the whole conflict into a war against NATO or into a nuclear war. So Belarus might become a liability for Russia. All in all, while Belarus entering the war would undoubtedly cause problems for Ukraine, it would likely be even more damaging for Belarus itself, and even for Russia. Meanwhile, the greatest effect of such a decision wouldn't be felt on the battlefield, but in a larger geopolitical arena where it would further escalate the conflict between NATO and Russia. So the likelihood of Belarus joining Russia on the front lines is fairly low.